When most people think of Bretton Woods, they're thinking of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank and the idea of a new financial architecture in the aftermath of World War II. And it was all of that and more. But the core issue was this concept that the United States military would go out and make the global oceans safe for anyone's commerce, no matter who you were, no matter what you did, no matter where you were selling, no matter who you were partnering with. Anyone could go anywhere. And that was a fundamental change in the international environment because it allowed countries that honestly had lost the war and lost badly to emerge from the wreckage with trade access as if they were the world's most powerful empire and could get anywhere at any time.
The fund is essential to winning and preserving peace. That is why the representatives of 44 nations here in Bretton Woods are taking steps to prevent a repetition of the currency chaos which has usually followed in the wake of war.
There was a catch there. For the Americans to do this for you, you had to sign up to be on our side during the Cold War. And that provided us with the alliance network that we needed to contain and ultimately beat back the Soviet Union.
It is up to the rest of us to stand behind the credit of the devastated and undeveloped countries and take our share in guaranteeing the lenders from ultimate loss. The whole world will join together in a mutual credit pool to shoulder risks which private investors might be unwilling to run.
Another characteristic of this structure was that the United States would not invest its economy in this new international network, because if it had done that, it would have just been another conquering empire. So we got this global structure where the United States did the heavy lifting on a security front and allowed this parallel economic structure to happen on a global basis, of which the Americans were at most side participants in. It's not that we didn't play at all, but as a percentage of GDP, we remain the least involved economy in the world, especially if you factor out the NAFTA countries. In terms of total import-export, where you're looking at something that's less than 5% of GDP. The numbers are going to be different based on who's doing the data, because different people weight different things differently and don't even count certain things. And when you're talking about modular manufacturing, where there's thousands of supply chain steps, getting good data is difficult at best. But pretty much everybody's data says that somewhere between 10 and 20% of US GDP is involved in imports and exports in some way. But roughly half of that is the NAFTA network. And roughly a third of what's left is U.S. energy and energy product exports. And so if you pull those out, you're talking 5% of GDP is all that's left. If you go up until 1992, because that's where we have a bit of a split in policy and decision making, up until that point, pretty much all of our involvement in the Middle East wasn't about getting crude out of the region for us. It was about getting crude out of the region for our allies, because the North American market for energy has largely been self-contained since the beginning. Remember that we were one of the major exporters during World War II that allowed the Europeans and even the Russians to fight. That generated a very different economic model, because we experienced things like the oil shocks in the 70s because oil prices are internationally linked. It is a broadly fungible and liquid commodity financially. But we were never in danger of an actual shortage. It was a price issue here. The shortage was an Eastern Hemispheric problem. It was a problem for Japan. It was a problem for Germany. And that's why we were involved, because the idea was if the United States does not rise to the occasion and contain instability in the Middle East, then the allies would no longer have an economic interest in partnering with the United States on security affairs. And for us, that was the only thing that mattered. And that's the reason why Iran, once it turned fundamentalist in 1979, was always an issue, because Iran always had that threat over the Persian Gulf energy exports. And if that went away, the alliance could theoretically go away. And so even now, 40 years later, when the United States is more and more populist and is less interested in maintaining all of this for any number of reasons, mostly domestic politics, we still get this knee-jerk reaction to anything that happens against Iran because we have been so exposed. That has always been the raw nerve. In many ways, Iran has always been the country on the planet that had the greatest capacity to disrupt our overall security plans. Now, I would argue that's no longer the case. We've moved on. But the emotional inertia there is immense. And we're certainly seeing that in political decisions today. You have to go back to the fact that we won the Cold War. And after 1992, we started to have a conversation with ourselves about what's Bretton Woods 2? How do we take this alliance, the greatest alliance in human history, and play it forward for another generation or two of American preeminence? How do we remake the human condition? How do we spread free market capitalism? How do we improve the rates of human rights? How do we push women's rights? How do we make the world a better place that we can then leave to our descendants? And the person who tried to get us to have that conversation was George Herbert Walker Bush.
Last one out of the Soviet Union, please turn out the lights.
The United States recognizes and welcomes the emergence of a free, independent, and democratic Russia.
And Americans decided that they didn't want to have that conversation. And instead, we went with Bill Clinton, who was much more focused on North America, much more populist and narcissistic. And from there, we went to W. Bush, and from there to Obama, and Obama to Trump, and Trump to Biden. And we've just kind of taken steps down that road. Despite the variety of policies and personalities that we have seen since 1992, what they all have in common is each one is a little bit more economically nationalist than the one that came before. So from an economic and political point of view, we've moved away from this structure. And while that's happened, we've also changed our military, specifically the Navy, into a form that I would argue is no longer even capable of maintaining the globalized network. We used to have a 600-ship Navy dominated by small vessels that could be almost everywhere at once. And so the idea of keeping the sea lanes open against threats was a viable policy. But since 1992, we've steadily reduced the size of the fleet while steadily increasing its tonnage. And so instead of having 600 ships that are mostly small, we now have about 250 ships that are centered around the aircraft carrier battle groups, of which we now have 12 super carriers and 10 jump carriers. And it's really hard for us to function independently of that anymore. Now, if you want to carry out a military operation and knock over a country, you have the right tools for the job. But if you want to throw a wide net and provide naval security everywhere, we no longer have the numbers or the types of ships that are necessary. Look at what's going on in the Red Sea right now with the Houthis taking pot shots at shipping. It is stressing us to the brink of keeping the Red Sea open because we no longer have enough vessels of the type that could do this. The Houthis are arguably the worst terrorists in the world, operating from the most worthless chunk of land. And if we had a second event like this anywhere in the world, I doubt the US Navy could rise to the occasion. So this is pushing us to the very brink of what is possible with our current military posture. And if it fails, the United States is not the country that's going to feel the pain. The country that's going to feel the most pain by far is going to be China because they're the most dependent on open seas. Even if they wanted to police, they don't have the ships with the range to get there. The only reason at all, in my opinion, that the Houthis matter is because every once in a while they take shots at the Saudi oil complex. But over the last 10 years, the Saudis have put up nets and jammers, which have pretty much reduced the damage to zero. So I am going to go with a big fat don't really care. It's not just politics that is driving the United States away from the system. I'd argue between demographic changes, economic reality, the Chinese rise, and the shift in the American naval posture that we can't do it anymore. We're going to have to do something Americans really hate doing. We're going to have to make some choices about what we want to protect and what we want to further. And it's really hard for me to see Yemen being part of that conversation.